Welcome to our overview for Sunday School teachers and Bible study leaders of Lifeway's Explore the Bible lesson of John chapter 18, verses 1 through 11, entitled I Am He, for Sunday, April 30th, 2023. Whenever my wife Cheryl and I are watching a movie or TV show, of course we don't watch very many these days, we do enjoy some of the old 1940s and 1950s classic movies and some BBC mysteries. But when we watch a show, we're always on the lookout for familiar actors and actresses that we see, and we'll say, "I think that's so and so from this show or such and such a program," and we'll look it up and see. So I might ask my group this Sunday: does anybody have a favorite actor or actress from the movies or from TV? For example, a couple of mine are Ralph Bellamy from the old Cary Grant movies, and of course Cary Grant himself. And I loved Alan Rickman, who recently passed away, played Colonel Brandon in Sense and Sensibility, and some of you may know him as Snape from Harry Potter. Most people probably have some kind of actor or TV personality they appreciate. I'm looking forward to hearing some of our class's favorites, who they are, and might learn something about our class members this week. But anyway, after you've shared those a little bit, have some good discussion, you can say, this morning we're going to look at four leading characters who are named in our story in John 18 today. Each of them are very different, and we have something that we can learn from each one of them. Context this week, we see something about the context in verse 1 here. It says, when Jesus had spoken these words, talking about the prayer he just prayed in John 17, the great high priestly prayer he prayed for his disciples then and now. When he'd finished praying, it says, he went forth with his disciples over the ravine of the Kidron, where there was a garden in which he entered with his disciples. Matthew 26:36 identifies this as the Garden of Gethsemane. John doesn't go into all the detail of Jesus' prayers in Gethsemane in this passage, but he focuses on the betrayal there that would lead Jesus to the cross. And we see several characters here in this scene. So my outline for this week would just be these four major players in this scene. Might call it a tale of four men or something like that. Number one, of course, Judas. Number two would be the Lord Jesus. The third one would be Peter. And the fourth one, most are not familiar with, a slave by the name of Malchus, and yet he plays a very important part. I might begin by just reading this passage. It's not that long, verses 1 through 11, and then say, what are we going to learn about each of these men named in the passage? Jesus and Judas and Peter and Malchus. I would begin perhaps with the betrayal and Judas. Verse 2 says Judas knew the place. He'd been there with Jesus before. Verse 3 says he came with the Roman cohort, a whole battalion of 600 men with officers and priests and the Pharisees. And I would ask my group, what do we learn about Judas in this passage? Well, of course, we learn he was a betrayer. Two times in this passage it says, Judas also who was betraying him. Verse 2, Judas also who was betraying him. Verse 5. So it emphasizes that, saying it twice. As we mentioned a couple of weeks ago, it's become a kind of popular thing in books and films to portray Judas as basically a good guy who is trying to force Jesus' hand and get him to show his power by giving him over to the Jews. But as we saw in John 12, Judas was not a good guy. Specifically says there in verse 6, he was a thief. He used to pilfer what was put into Jesus' money box for the poor. But Judas walked with Jesus for 3 years with the other disciples. He saw and experienced everything they did, but he turned on Jesus and betrayed him. Several of the Psalms in the Old Testament speak about betrayal, like Psalm 55, verses 12 through 14. David speaks there about his enemies and the anguish that he's facing. Then he says in verses 12 through 14, for it is not an enemy who reproaches me, then I could bear it, nor is it one who hates me who has exalted himself against me, then I could hide myself from him. But it is you, a man my equal, my companion, my familiar friend, we who had sweet fellowship together, walked in the house of God in the throng. Psalm 41:9 says, even my close friend in whom I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted up his heel against me. So many of the Psalms are messianic prophecies foreshadowing who Jesus would be and what he would experience. These are some of those. Jesus lived out the Psalm. Judas, who is not an enemy, but one of the 12 Jesus picked, was his companion with whom he had fellowship and all of that. So Jesus knew betrayal.
This is one of the many things he has in common with us. Hebrews says he was tempted in all things as we are. He's been through everything that we have been through. And this is one of those things. Probably all of us have felt betrayed at one time or another. I'm not going to ask for any examples of that Sunday morning. It's hurtful for many of us. But I think we all know the feeling of being betrayed. And what we see here is Jesus knew that feeling too. He has that in common with us. He knew what it was like to have a friend who betrayed him. So we see the person Judas here, who was a betrayer. Then secondly, of course, we see the master. We see Jesus. What do we learn about Jesus in this passage? I might ask my group. I'd let them answer what they see, but I would emphasize at least three things here. I see very important things that we learn about Jesus. Letter A, I would say, we learn that Jesus was in charge. Verse 4 says, Jesus knowing all the things that were coming upon him. Jesus was not surprised by this ambush. He knew exactly what he was walking into. There was a tragic accident in our community here in Angleton this morning. A young man backed out of his driveway and hit a senior adult woman known and loved in our town, and she ended up passing away today. She and her husband were just out for a walk when this tragedy befell them. It shocks our community and so many who knew her. From time to time, we get ambushed with things like that just blindside us. But the thing about Jesus is, he wasn't blindsided. He knew. It says Jesus knowing. He knew exactly what he was going into. He'd said the Son of Man has come to give his life a ransom for many. We saw a couple of weeks ago how many times he said in advance he knew he was going to be delivered over to die. He had said in John 13 he knew he was going to be betrayed by someone who was at that meal with him. And here it says Jesus knowing. It's one thing to be blindsided by something, but Jesus knew. He knew. He purposefully stepped out into that tragedy that was coming, and he did it to save us. And of course, that's the gospel. And I would share the gospel at this point with my class. We need to share it from time to time in our class, if not every week. I'd share the gospel. We have sinned. We've all sinned. We can't judge Judas too harshly. We've all disobeyed God. We've all betrayed him by doing what we knew we shouldn't have. Somehow in God's great mercy, he still loved us. And Jesus came to take the judgment that was deservedly coming on us. And he did it purposefully. Jesus knowing. So we see he was in control. And related to that, here in the second point, we see Jesus' power. In verse 4, Jesus asked the group who came against him, "Whom do you seek?" And when he said, "I am he," verse 6 says they drew back and fell to the ground. That word fell to the ground is the same Greek word pipto is used in Matthew 2. When the Magi fell to the ground to worship the child Jesus, they were cast back just by Jesus' words saying, "I am he." And you might ask your group, what do you think this shows us about Jesus? Well, it shows us those words, "I am," of course, talking about the I am God, that he is God. Also shows us his power. He was in control. Again, it shows us his power. He was letting them take him. Jesus was no helpless victim here. He was purposefully allowing them to arrest him. It's like we are going to see next week in John 19:11, where Jesus told Pilate, "You would have no authority over me unless it was given to you from above." Pilate was not in charge. The Jews were not in charge. Judas was not in charge. Jesus was in charge. He had all power. Just his word, "I am," sent them hurtling backwards, but he allowed them to take him so he could die for us. Amazing love. And thirdly, we see Jesus' care in this passage as well. He'd asked them in verse 4, "Who do you seek?" And he sent them hurtling back. He asked them again then in verse 7, "Whom do you seek?" They said, "Jesus the Nazarene." And verse 8 says, he told them, "I told you I am he. So if you seek me, let these go their way." What does that show? It shows his concern for his followers. They didn't need to be taken. They didn't need to die. John 13:1 says, "Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end." Verse 9 says, "This was to fulfill the word which he spoke of those whom you've given me. I lost not one." It's just another example of the love and the care that Jesus has for us. Then thirdly, I would look at the person Peter, for a third actor in this scene. I asked my group, what do we learn about Peter in this passage? Well, verse 10 says, "Simon Peter, then having a sword, drew it, struck the high priest's slave, and cut off his right ear." Typical Simon Peter, right? Rashly jumping into something here, pulling out his sword to fight the group coming to get Jesus. Then notice in verse 11, though, Jesus' response to Peter. put the sword into the sheath. The cup which the Father has given me, shall I not drink it? There's actually a huge point here. Jesus says to Peter, put the sword into the sheath. Jesus does not want his followers to do his work or try to advance his kingdom with the sword. There are political and religious groups who do believe in spreading their influence by the sword or through military means. For example, Islam spread all over the Middle East, much of Africa, and into Europe under the banner of Islam or the sword. You convert to Islam or we'll kill you. It's still happening in places in Africa today. I read not too long ago, you deny Christ and follow Islam or we will shoot you, put you to death. That is not how we spread Christianity. Those who use violence or force to try to advance the kingdom somehow, they are not following the teachings of Jesus. Example of that in 1519, Hernando Cortez landed in Mexico to take the country for Spain. As Christians, Cortez told his men in the midst of battle against the Aztecs, we were obliged to make war against the enemies of our faith. This was militant Christianity in its literal sense from Tony Horowitz's book, A Voyage Long and Strange. Cortez and his men were like Peter here in John 18. They thought they were doing God's will by taking up the sword, spread the kingdom by conquering people. But Jesus told Peter, that's not how we are to spread the gospel. And you might talk with your group about this. Why do you think we are not to spread the gospel by force? Y'all can talk about that, but I would say for one, the gospel is salvation by faith. You can't force someone to believe. You can conquer a country, but you can't force them to believe. Military conquest does not create saving faith. Only the Word of God does that in a heart. Also, it goes against God's love for people to just harm them or kill them. He loves people. Jesus said in John 9:56, the Son of Man did not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them. Then also it harms us when we harm other people. Jesus said, those who live by the sword will die by the sword. Proverbs says, the violence of the wicked will come back on them. When you hurt someone else, you end up hurting yourself. So for all these reasons and more, Jesus has put the sword into the sheath. My old seminary professor, J.W. McGorman, once said, radical Christianity is not being willing to kill for your faith. Radical Christianity is being willing to die for your faith. We don't spread the gospel by killing, threatening, or harming other people. We spread the gospel by being so committed to it that we are willing to die for our faith in Jesus. When we're so committed, like Jim Elliot and his friends were, who flew to South America to share the gospel with a remote tribe there, who killed them. When we are so committed like that we'll go to dangerous places and be willing to die for our faith, that is how the gospel spreads. But Jesus told Peter, and he's telling us today, put the sword into the sheath. We don't spread the gospel with the sword by force. We spread the gospel by sharing his word and by letting the Holy Spirit touch people's hearts by faith. Then finally, I'd introduce this character Malchus here, Malchus the slave. What do we learn about him? Not a whole lot. It just gives his name. But then I would ask, why do you think they gave the name of the servant here? This is actually very important. They gave his name because he was a real person. This really happened. There were people who knew him, who could corroborate the story. This is a powerful point. Dr. Richard Bauckham has written an impactful book called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. It is a long book, about 700 pages long, very lots of academic language, but in it he talks about how the people who lived in Palestine in those days knew the people whose names are given in the gospel, like this Malchus. So you couldn't just make something up like a lot of people think the writers of the gospels did. Real people's names are given in these accounts, Malchus and others. There were people alive when the Gospels were written who lived through these things, who could say, yes, this really happened, or no, that didn't. I know that guy. So you couldn't just make up things. These were real people with real names, and the people who knew them would know better. It'd be like if somebody wrote a book and said, there was this pastor named Shawn who lived in Angleton, and he was a miraculous golfer. Every time he played golf, he got a hole-in-one. Well, anybody could write that. You could make that up. But if you said he played golf with James Peterson and Drew Culpepper, somebody could say, I know those guys, and you could go ask them for yourself, is this what happened? Was he really like that? And they'd laugh and tell you, no, the only thing he hit every time we played was the water. These real people would tell you the truth. You couldn't just get away with making things up when you use real names of real people who are involved.
That's how it was with these names in the Gospels. You couldn't just make up anything and put it in these Gospels like some people claim. There are names of real people here who were known. They could be asked and it could be checked out. And if other people knew them, and they'd know if these things were true or not. So Bauckham says in his book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, this is one of the strongest evidences for the truthfulness and reliability of the gospel accounts. Real names of real people like Malchus and many others throughout these gospels. Every time you see one of these names, it's pointing to a person who was able during those days to give testimony and give witness. This really happened. It was not just made up. So Malchus' place in this story is very brief, but by giving his name is actually very powerful. This man and or people who knew him was alive, and they could testify this all really happened. The gospel of Jesus is not a myth. It really happened to real people, and the gospel of Jesus will still touch and change real people like us today. Well, I hope this helped you some with your preparation for the lesson this week. Remember, if you'd like to read or print out a text version of this overview, maybe print out one of the quotes or stories or something like that, that's available on my blog at www.shawnthomas.com. I'll put that address in the comment section below. If you'll hit subscribe to this video on YouTube, YouTube will automatically send you next week's video and you won't have to search for it. If you write something in the comment section below, I'll be sure to pray for you and your group by name and any prayer requests you list there this week. Per my licensing agreement with Lifeway, these weekly lessons are based on content from Explore the Bible Adult Resources. The presentation is my own. It has not been reviewed by Lifeway. Lifeway resources are available at goexplorethebible.com and goexplorethebible.com/adults-training. And if you have questions about Explore the Bible resources, you can send emails to explorethebible@lifeway.com.